August 18th, 1590. Governor John White steps onto Roanoke Island after 3 agonizing years of absence. The settlement stands empty, silent, waiting. No bodies, no battle scars, no screams echoing from the forest. Only absence, only questions that would haunt centuries. Governor White's granddaughter, Virginia Dare, would have been 10 years old, the first English child born in the New World. She was here somewhere, or she was not. 115 colonists, his daughter Eleanor, his granddaughter Virginia, his hopes for an English foothold in the New World, all gone. But he was not alone in his discovery. One object remained, one message, carved deliberately into the bark of a wooden post, weathered by salt and wind. CROATOAN. 7 letters, no distress signal, no cross carved into bark, as had been agreed upon before White's departure. Just a single word. The word meant something, but to whom? Was it a place, a Native American people, a direction, a sign of hope, or a monument to despair? 3 years earlier, in 1587, Governor White had sailed for England. His daughter Eleanor remained here, pregnant with his granddaughter. He promised to return within a year, but the Anglo-Spanish War erupted. The Spanish Armada threatened English shores. Naval battles consumed resources. Supplies meant for Roanoke were diverted to war efforts. 1 year stretched into 3. White tried desperately to organize rescue expeditions. Political obstacles mounted. Sponsors lost interest. The New World waited. When White finally stepped ashore on that August morning in 1590, he expected chaos or calm. He expected death or welcome. He did not expect silence. The settlement had been systematically dismantled, not destroyed by violence, methodically taken apart, homes disassembled, supplies buried or hidden, a retreat, not a massacre. The deliberateness haunted White. Someone had made choices here. Careful decisions, plans, but no bodies, no graves, no skeletons. Virginia Dare had been born here in 1587, the first English child in the New World. Her baptism was recorded. She was real. She existed. Then she disappeared. Eleanor Dare, her mother and John White's daughter, vanished along with her child. 113 other colonists, gone. All of them, complete erasure. And then that word, CROATOAN, carved with deliberation into weathered wood, not scratched in panic, carved with purpose, a message, a direction, a final word. The agreement had been clear before White departed. If colonists were forced to leave, they would carve a cross above any directional word, a distress signal, a warning. No cross appeared on the CROATOAN post. No distress signal marked the settlement. This suggested choice, not calamity, planned departure, not desperate flight. But where had they gone? The CROATOAN people were a real Native American nation living south of Roanoke. Had the colonists joined them, intermarried, found refuge in their villages? Governor White searched the settlement for additional messages. He found earthworks dismantled. He found trees stripped of bark and defaced with marks. Nothing more, nothing clear. The 3-year delay had been catastrophic. Time had erased whatever clues might have remained fresh. Rain and wind and wild growth had obscured paths. John White stood in the ruins of his dreams. His daughter was gone. His granddaughter, the first English child born in America, had vanished into history. The word CROATOAN would echo through 4 centuries. It would become America's greatest colonial mystery. It would birth countless theories, desperate searches, and unanswered questions. What happened to the Lost Colony of Roanoke? Did they perish in the wilderness? Did they integrate with native peoples? Did they establish a hidden settlement inland? The truth, like the colonists themselves, had disappeared. All that remained was silence, abandonment, and 7 letters carved into weathered wood. CROATOAN. In the waning years of the 16th century, England stood at a crossroads. While Spain commanded the oceans and the riches of the New World, one man dared to imagine a different future for the English crown. That man was Sir Walter Raleigh, a courtier of extraordinary ambition and vision. In 1584, Queen Elizabeth I granted him a charter that would change the course of history, the right to establish an English colony in the New World. This was not merely a commercial venture. It was a calculated act of imperial defiance. Spain had monopolized the Americas for nearly a century, and England hungered to break that stranglehold and claim its own piece of the New World's boundless promise. Raleigh wasted no time. In April 1584, he dispatched 2 ships under the command of Captains Philip Amadas and Arthur Barlow to scout the coast of what is now North Carolina. Their mission was straightforward: find suitable land, assess resources, and make peaceful contact with the indigenous peoples. In July of that year, after weeks at sea, Amadas and Barlow reached the outer banks of present-day North Carolina. What they discovered was a land of extraordinary natural abundance: lush forests teeming with game, crystalline waters brimming with fish, and fertile soil that seemed to promise effortless prosperity. But the English explorers were not alone. The land belonged to the CROATOAN people and their CROATOAN neighbors, sophisticated societies with their own complex governance, trade networks, and deep spiritual connection to the land. 2 members of these nations would become central to the unfolding tragedy: Manteo and Wanchese. Manteo and Wanchese boarded Amadas and Barlow's ships, becoming the first indigenous ambassadors to England. For the English, this represented a triumph of diplomacy. For Manteo and Wanchese, the voyage was a transformative journey into a world utterly foreign to their experience, one that would test their loyalties and reshape their fates. When Amadas and Barlow returned to England in 1584, they brought glowing reports. The New World, they declared, was a paradise waiting to be claimed. Raleigh seized the moment and named the territory Virginia, honoring the Virgin Queen herself. The vision of an English foothold in America was no longer a dream. It was becoming policy, yet beneath the rhetoric of discovery and commerce lay a darker impulse. English colonial ideology was beginning to crystallize around notions of racial superiority and the right to subjugate indigenous peoples. The romanticized vision of Virginia would soon clash brutally with the reality of encountering a sovereign people defending their homeland. In 1585, Raleigh orchestrated the first permanent English settlement. He placed it under the command of Ralph Lane, a seasoned military man, and appointed Manteo as liaison to the indigenous nations. Lane brought with him over 100 soldiers and colonists, transforming Virginia from an exploration into military occupation. Ralph Lane was no diplomat. He viewed the local tribes through the lens of military strategy, seeing potential threats rather than potential partners. His letters reveal growing paranoia and a readiness to use violence. The careful balance Amadas and Barlow had struck with indigenous leaders began to crumble under Lane's command. Tensions escalated rapidly. English colonists, unfamiliar with the American environment and dependent on indigenous knowledge, began demanding food and supplies. When local tribes were reluctant to part with resources during their own lean seasons, Lane interpreted refusal as hostility. He responded with military expeditions and shows of force. In 1586, tensions exploded into open violence. Lane orchestrated the killing of Wingina, a principal chief of the CROATOAN, in a calculated military strike. This assassination shattered any remaining hope for peaceful coexistence. The indigenous nations that had welcomed the English explorers now viewed them as invaders and enemies. Manteo, who had traveled to England and returned as interpreter and guide, found himself caught between 2 worlds. His initial role as bridge builder had become untenable. The very people he had helped welcome now seemed bent on conquest and domination of his own people. Lane's colony was failing. The settlement was plagued by disease, starvation, and constant warfare with surrounding tribes. By 1586, the colonists were desperate. When English ships arrived that summer under Sir Francis Drake, Lane made the decision to abandon Virginia and returned to England. The first English colony in America had collapsed after less than a year, yet the dream of Virginia did not die with Lane's retreat. In 1587, Raleigh organized another attempt, this time under John White, with families and colonists intended to establish a permanent settlement. White brought Manteo with him once again, still hoping that indigenous diplomacy might succeed where military force had failed. White established Roanoke Island as the colony's seat, named after the local Roanoke people. Unlike Lane's military outpost, this settlement was designed for permanence, complete with families and craftsmen. For a brief moment, it seemed that the English vision of a new world settlement might finally succeed. The shadow of Ralph Lane's violence, however, hung over every interaction. The local tribes remembered the murder of their chief. They remembered broken promises and military aggression. The ground on which John White sought to build a peaceful colony had been poisoned by the ambitions and brutality of his predecessor. By 1588, John White made a fateful decision. The colony needed supplies desperately, and he agreed to return to England to secure provisions and additional colonists. He promised to return within the year, but fate and the tumultuous politics of empire had other plans. White would not return to Roanoke for 3 long years. In those 3 years, the Spanish Armada would attack England. Civil conflicts would erupt. The momentum of English colonial expansion would be disrupted by the very imperial struggles that had motivated Raleigh's Virginia project in the first place. John White's colony would be left to fend for itself in a dangerous, hostile land. The dream of a New England, as Raleigh had envisioned it, was already transforming into something far darker and more tragic. What began as exploration and commercial ambition had become entangled with conquest, violence, and the ruthless logic of empire. Manteo and his people would pay an unforgettable price for the English dream. 117 souls boarded ships bound for a new world. They carried families, hopes, and the weight of England's ambitions. But their voyage would become a descent into isolation and betrayal. July 1587. The expedition led by John White departed England with families, not soldiers. This was meant to be permanent, a true colony on the American coast. The fleet's navigator was Simon Fernandez, a Portuguese pilot hired to guide them to the Chesapeake Bay, a location chosen for its deeper waters and safer harbor. But Fernandez had other intentions. Against White's explicit instructions, he diverted the fleet toward Roanoke Island, a treacherous, exposed settlement abandoned years before. White protested furiously. The Chesapeake was their destination. Roanoke was undefended, isolated, and surrounded by hostile territory, but Fernandez refused to sail further. The colonists were stranded. August 1587. The colonists began constructing fortifications on Roanoke Island. They were isolated, vulnerable, and entirely dependent on supplies from England. The decision to abandon the Chesapeake would haunt them. Relations with the local CROATOAN and Secretan peoples were initially cautious but manageable. Then, on July 16th, tragedy struck. Colonist George Howe was murdered while gathering crabs in shallow waters. Howe's death shattered the fragile peace. The colonists believed hostile Secretan warriors were responsible, though some accounts suggest local Roanoke tribe involvement. The murder revealed a brutal truth: they were not welcome here. In August, Virginia Dare was born, the first English child born in the New World. She represented hope amid escalating danger, but her arrival underscored the colonists' dire situation. Families with infants trapped in hostile territory. John White faced an impossible choice. The colony was running desperately short of supplies. Someone had to return to England for provisions. Without intervention, everyone would starve. White made the fateful decision: he would go himself. The colonists begged him not to leave. They feared abandonment would make them vulnerable. But White believed he had no choice. Only his authority and connections in England could secure the vital supplies needed for survival. Before departing, White established a code with the colonists. If they relocated, they would carve their destination into a tree. There would be no distress signal, just a simple word carved in bark. In August 1587, John White's ship sailed away from Roanoke Island, leaving 117 colonists, including his daughter Eleanor, his newborn granddaughter Virginia, and countless other families, exposed and isolated. White promised to return within 1 year with supplies. He had no idea that England's attention would soon shift to an existential threat: the approaching Spanish Armada. The colonists' fate would become secondary to national survival. The Spanish Armada's approach consumed England. Every ship, every resource, every official's attention was demanded by the threat to the nation itself. White's colony, vulnerable, isolated and dependent, was forgotten. 3 years would pass before John White could return to Roanoke. 3 years of war, delay, and political upheaval. When he finally sailed back to his colony in 1590, he would discover something that defied explanation. John White had left behind his daughter, his granddaughter Virginia Dare, and over 100 colonists. What he would find upon his return would transform this desperate supply mission into history's most enduring American mystery. Governor John White returned to Virginia in 1590, desperate to discover what became of his daughter Eleanor, her husband Ananias, and their newborn Virginia, the first English child born in the New World. What he found would launch 3 centuries of investigation, desperate theories, and a mystery that remains fundamentally unsolved. An entire colony had simply ceased to exist. The colony at Roanoke had vanished, but the circumstances of that vanishing would suggest something far more deliberate than a sudden massacre or disease. White's expedition had been delayed by treacherous Atlantic crossings and military obligations to the Crown. By the time he gathered a relief fleet to resupply his colonists, 3 years had passed since he last saw them in 1587. In August 1590, White's ships finally approached CROATOAN Island, but nature would deny him the answers he desperately sought. A violent hurricane swept across the Carolina coast, making landfall impossible. White's crew was terrified. The storm raged with such ferocity that continuing the search became a death sentence. Reluctantly, White ordered his ships to turn back across the Atlantic. The search was abandoned, but White had left precise instructions with the colonists before departing in 1587. If they faced danger, they were to carve a cross into a tree. If they relocated voluntarily, they would inscribe their destination without a cross symbol. When White finally returned to Roanoke, 3 years after leaving, he discovered the word CROATOAN carved into a wooden post at the entrance to the fort, with no distress cross. The colonists had not been killed. They had left deliberately. But where had they gone? And what did CROATOAN actually mean? White assumed they had sailed to CROATOAN Island, a small sanctuary island south of Roanoke. He attempted one final search, but the hurricane winds had other plans. What White did not discover that day, what would only emerge decades later through testimony and archaeological evidence, was a far more complex narrative. The physical evidence painted a picture of systematic, orderly preparation, not panicked flight. Buried beneath the fort's structures, investigators later found the remnants of White's personal chests, his navigation instruments, his maps, his cherished possessions. They had been deliberately buried, then looted by those who remained behind. The boats were gone. The animals had been slaughtered systematically. The fort's palisade walls showed no signs of violent assault, no burn marks, no bloodstains, no arrows embedded in wood. This was not the signature of warfare. Instead, the archaeological record revealed something more unsettling: methodical dismantling. Buildings had been carefully taken apart. Equipment had been packed and transported. Someone had been planning this departure for months. The question shifted from what happened to something far more disturbing. Where did they go, and who knew about it? The answer would come from the most unexpected source: the indigenous peoples of Virginia. Chief Powhatan, the powerful leader of the Powhatan Confederacy, would later relay information to English settlers about the missing colonists. According to his testimony, the survivors had not gone to CROATOAN Island. They had traveled inland. Powhatan claimed the colonists had integrated with indigenous groups, but he also revealed something darker. Some survivors had been deliberately killed, murdered by tribal warriors as a warning against English expansion. Not all colonists had survived their inland journey. Later expeditions, including those from the newly established Jamestown colony in 1607, attempted to locate the remaining colonists. None succeeded. The inland groups either did not possess survivors, or they had chosen to remain hidden from English search parties. As years turned to decades, the mystery deepened. No authenticated remains of Roanoke colonists were ever discovered by English searchers. No conclusive evidence emerged of their fate. They had become ghosts in the American wilderness. The carved word CROATOAN would haunt researchers for centuries. Was it a destination, a coded message, the name of the indigenous group that sheltered them, or something else entirely? A final desperate clue pointing to a truth no one could access. What remained was a documentary crime scene, missing colonists, buried and looted personal effects, systematically dismantled structures, testimony of indigenous leaders about inland survivors and execution, but no bodies, no definitive answers, only questions that echoed across 3 centuries. The lost colony of Roanoke remains precisely that, lost, vanished not in a moment of catastrophe, but through a deliberate transformation so complete that history itself could not recover it. Somewhere in the Virginia wilderness, the truth waits, buried beneath 400 years of soil and silence. Beneath the Carolina soil lies evidence that refuses to fit into our history books. For centuries, anthropologists have documented something impossible. Native American tribes with gray eyes and English surnames. The Lumbee people of North Carolina carry genetic markers and linguistic traits that cannot be explained by indigenous ancestry alone. The Hatteras Island communities along the Outer Banks display similar anomalies. Oral histories speak of English-speaking ancestors arriving before official colonial records. In 2015, archaeological surveys near Merry Hill, North Carolina, began uncovering artifacts that challenged conventional settlement timelines. Among the indigenous refuse pits and structures, researchers discovered fragments of English ceramics, metalwork, and building materials dated to the early 1500s. These objects predated any known English settlement by 50 years. They were not traded goods, they were domestic waste. At Cape Creek on Hatteras Island, excavations revealed a similar pattern. English artifacts embedded within Native American settlement layers. Stratigraphic analysis confirmed these were not intrusions from later periods. The English materials and native ceramics had accumulated together over decades. Dr. Mark Mathis, lead archaeologist at East Carolina University, stated these findings suggest cohabitation, peaceful cohabitation, centuries before Jamestown. The assimilation theory proposes that early English survivors, or settlers, integrated directly into native communities rather than establishing separate colonies. Living descendants of both the Lumbee and Hatteras Island communities possess oral histories describing English-speaking ancestors who arrived mysteriously and became part of the tribe. These narratives have been dismissed as folklore, yet they predate academic investigation by centuries and remain consistent across multiple generations. But the most provocative evidence emerged from an unlikely source: John White's famous map of Virginia, drawn in 1585. When conservators used enhanced imaging techniques to examine the map, they discovered something extraordinary: a hidden symbol beneath a strategically placed patch. The symbol appeared to mark an inland location near present-day Merry Hill, designated with English cartographic notation suggesting a fortification or settlement. John White never publicly acknowledged this location. No written record mentions why it was hidden beneath a patch, or what structure it represented. Archaeologists theorize this marked the location of a secret English settlement, one White deliberately concealed from official Spanish colonial intelligence networks. If such a settlement existed and failed, its survivors would have needed to integrate with nearby native populations to survive. The artifacts suggest they did exactly that. The grey eyes documented among Lumbee and Hatteras descendants may represent genetic memory of these lost English populations. The English surnames recorded in tribal registries by the 1800s may reflect naming practices adopted from ancestors no official history acknowledges. Modern DNA analysis of Lumbee tribal members reveals European ancestry at rates inconsistent with standard colonial interaction patterns, yet mainstream archaeology has largely ignored these findings, categorizing them as anomalies rather than challenging fundamental colonial narratives. The sites near Merry Hill and Cape Creek remain partially excavated. Funding for continued investigation remains limited and sporadic. Each discovery raises more questions than it answers. Were these settlements intentional English colonies or castaway communities rebuilding from disaster? Did the English adopt native cultures willingly, or were they absorbed by necessity? The archaeological record cannot speak to intention. What remains certain is this: the soil of North Carolina holds evidence that contradicts our established history of English colonization in America. The descendants of the Lumbee and Hatteras peoples live with this knowledge daily. Their oral traditions and genetic inheritance carry a history academia is only beginning to acknowledge. Until excavations resume with adequate funding and institutional support, the full story of English assimilation into native Carolina communities will remain buried. The ghosts in the archaeology are not supernatural. They are the lost stories of people who vanished, not in death, but in integration. 4 centuries have passed since Virginia Dare vanished into the American wilderness. Yet the silence persists. The theories remain. Each one whispers a different truth about what happened to the colonists of Roanoke. Some scholars believe the colonists achieved what seemed impossible: genuine peace with the CROATOAN people. Archaeological evidence suggests cultural exchange, shared pottery techniques, intermarriage. Others argue the truth was far darker. Hostile tribes from inland territories may have attacked the settlement, overwhelming the colonists in a swift, catastrophic assault. A third theory points to Spanish involvement. Spanish explorers viewed English colonization as a direct threat to their dominance in the New World. Disease and famine remain the most haunting possibility. Without resupply ships, without adequate crops, the settlement may have simply withered away, quietly, completely. Virginia Dare herself became America's first myth. Born in the New World, she represented hope itself. When she vanished, that hope transformed into legend. She appeared in ghost stories. Settlers reported seeing a pale woman in English dress wandering the North Carolina forests. Indigenous peoples spoke of a white spirit child. The tale evolved through centuries. Some claimed she married a CROATOAN chief and lived a full life in the wilderness, her line continuing in tribal communities. Others insisted she was a restless spirit, forever seeking her lost parents, forever trapped between 2 worlds that would never accept her. The lost colony became woven into American consciousness. It represented the frontier itself, beautiful, promising, and ultimately unknowable. Every generation has tried to solve Roanoke. Victorian historians approached it with rigid logic. 20th century archaeologists dug methodically into Virginia soil. They found pottery fragments. They discovered earthworks. They uncovered evidence of structures, but the central mystery remained impenetrable. Modern DNA analysis has opened new possibilities. Researchers have extracted genetic material from skeletal remains found in the region, comparing markers to known CROATOAN descendants. Some preliminary findings suggest genetic continuity. Certain family lines in modern North Carolina communities carry markers consistent with English ancestry alongside Native American heritage. Yet even DNA cannot tell the complete story. It cannot reveal whether integration was voluntary or coerced. It cannot capture the lived experience of survival. Ongoing excavations continue at Fort Raleigh. Each season brings new artifacts. Each discovery raises as many questions as it answers. In 2015, thermal imaging detected a massive palisade structure that historical records had never mentioned. Walls, a fortress, something hidden from history itself. But who built it? When? For what purpose? The questions multiply. The mystery deepens with each revelation. Perhaps the silence is the point. Perhaps Roanoke teaches us that not every history can be recovered. Not every truth can be excavated. Some mysteries belong to the land itself. The American wilderness kept the colonists' fate as its secret, and it may never surrender it completely. Virginia Dare remains the symbol of this enduring enigma. The first English child born in America, the first to disappear into its depths. Her name appears on no death records. No burial site bears her marker. She exists only in absence, in the space where certainty cannot reach. The CROATOAN word carved into the tree trunk haunts historians still. CROATOAN. No distress signal, no cryptic secondary message, simply a word. Was it a message? A destination? A name? The simplicity of it suggests truth. Complex explanations require evidence. This requires only interpretation. For 400 years, Americans have gazed into the Roanoke silence and seen reflections of themselves, their hopes, their fears, their need for answers. The Lost Colony endures as America's first unsolved mystery because it precedes America itself. It belongs to the era when the continent was still genuinely unknown. Every subsequent American mystery builds upon this silence. The unknown continent, the unknowable wilderness, the secrets buried in American soil. Perhaps someday, new technology will provide answers. DNA analysis may definitively prove integration. Ground-penetrating radar may reveal hidden graves. Linguistic studies may decode the CROATOAN cipher. But perhaps Roanoke's power lies precisely in its refusal to be solved. It reminds us that not everything can be known, not everything should be. The silence of Roanoke is not empty. It is full of voices, the colonists, the CROATOAN, Virginia Dare, all speaking across centuries in a language we can never quite understand. In the end, the Lost Colony teaches us this. America itself began with a mystery. Our nation was born not from certainty, but from profound unknowing. That silence has shaped us ever since. It continues to call to us. Perhaps it always will.